While teaching my son to swim, the neighbor leaned over the rail. Careful, he's got my genes, not yours. I never thought one casual afternoon at the pool could detonate my entire life. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't tap politely on the door. It doesn't give you time to prepare. It arrives in one single line, dropped at the exact second when you're least guarded. For me, it happened while I was waist-deep in chlorinated water, holding my son under his arms, encouraging him to kick, to float, to trust me. And then a voice from above cut through everything. But I should start earlier. It was a Saturday in June, one of those heavy days when the sun feels too close, baking the pavement, drawing families out of their apartments with towels slung over shoulders. Our building had a communal pool, small, but big enough for kids to splash around and neighbors to loiter with cheap beers. My wife Mira had suggested we take Leo down for a swim lesson. He was 5, still nervous around water, clinging to my neck whenever I tried to coax him into floating. She said he'd feel safer if I taught him, and truthfully, I enjoyed those moments. A father guiding his son, that picture-perfect bond people frame and put on mantles. Mira sat nearby in a lounge chair, legs crossed, scrolling on her phone, but occasionally glancing up to call encouragement. "You're doing great, Leo. Listen to Daddy." Her voice carried over the splash of kids cannonballing at the other end. And then there was Kurt. Kurt was our neighbor 2 doors down. Mid-30s, always tanned, always smirking, the kind of guy who acted like the complex was his personal kingdom. He had a way of leaning into conversations, never quite respecting boundaries. I tolerated him because that's what you do in apartment life, but truthfully, I never liked him. Mira used to say I was too harsh, that he was just friendly, though I noticed how she never seemed entirely comfortable when he hung around. That afternoon, he appeared as if summoned. Beer in hand, sunglasses perched on his head, he strolled along the deck until he stopped right at the railing above where I stood in the pool with Leo. He leaned casually, watching us like it was a show he'd paid for. "Careful," he called down, voice dripping with false concern. "He's got my genes, not yours." The words landed like a body dropped into still water. I froze, arms still supporting Leo, who giggled obliviously and splashed at my chest. My brain struggled to process what I'd just heard. At first, I thought maybe he meant something else. Maybe it was a joke about swimming technique, some idiotic macho comment. But then I looked up. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't laughing. He was studying me, and then his gaze flicked, just briefly, toward Mira. That was when everything shifted. Her face. I will never forget her face in that moment. Myra's phone slid onto her lap. The color drained out of her skin, leaving her pale as chalk. Her lips parted, not to argue or laugh or call Kurt an idiot, but in stunned silence. Her eyes locked on him with raw panic, as if he had just shouted her darkest secret across the pool. No one else seemed to notice, but I did. I looked from her to him and back again. Kurt took a long swig of his beer, muttered something about just looking out for the kid, and walked off like nothing had happened. Mira recovered quickly, too quickly, forcing a smile when I carried Leo to the shallow end. She asked if I wanted a drink, pretended like nothing was wrong. But I had seen it. That flicker of dread in her eyes. The look of someone caught. For the rest of the swim, my chest felt tight. Every time Leo laughed, splashing water into my face, I felt a strange distance, like I was suddenly watching a scene from outside my own life. Was it possible? Could there be even a sliver of truth to what Kurt had said? Back upstairs, things only got stranger. Leo fell asleep early from all the activity, curled up on the couch with damp hair, smelling of chlorine. Mira busied herself in the kitchen, moving with too much energy, like someone performing normality. She asked if I wanted pasta, if I'd remembered to pay the internet bill, if I wanted to watch a movie. Her chatter was relentless, as though silence would invite questions. I excused myself, went into the bedroom, and sat in the dark. My thoughts spiraled. It's amazing how quickly the mind rewinds once suspicion creeps in. I thought back to Myra's pregnancy years ago. She had been distant at times, claiming hormones, exhaustion, mood swings. I thought of how Kurt had been around then, how he'd offered to carry her groceries, how he'd once helped her fix a leaky faucet when I was at work. I remembered brushing it off, trusting her. But trust can rot from the inside without you realizing. Later that night, while Mira slept, I stood by Leo's room and just stared at him. His small chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. His hair glistened in the faint night-light glow. People always said he had Myra's eyes, Myra's smile. But now, all I could see was absence. What if none of him was mine? The next morning, life carried on like nothing had happened. Neighbors watered plants, kids rode bikes, the smell of coffee wafted through open doors. But for me, everything had changed. That one sentence had cracked open a world I could never close again. I tried to convince myself it was just Kurt being cruel. He had always been smug. Maybe he wanted to needle me. Maybe he was jealous. But then Myra's face replayed in my mind again and again. If there was nothing to hide, why had she looked terrified? I began watching her differently. She seemed careful now, too careful, almost rehearsed in how she spoke to me. When I asked about Kurt, she brushed it off, changed the subject, suddenly interested in laundry or Leo's school forms. She had always been good at dodging conflict, but this was something else. That week, Kurt passed me in the hallway, smirk firmly in place. He clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Good job teaching the boy. He's a quick learner." He emphasized the word boy in a way that chilled me. I forced a tight smile and kept walking, but inside, rage simmered. At night, I lay awake next to Mira, studying the slope of her shoulder, the way she turned away from me in her sleep. My mind played with the idea like a knife. What if Leo wasn't mine? What if the last 5 years had been built on a lie? The thought made me sick, but it also lit something else inside me, a need to know. I decided to test the waters. One evening, while Mira was washing dishes, I mentioned offhand that Kurt had said something weird at the pool. I expected her to laugh, roll her eyes, dismiss him. Instead, she stiffened, clattered a plate into the sink, and muttered, "He's always been inappropriate. Don't pay attention." Then she dried her hands and walked off without looking at me. That told me more than her words. Because guilt doesn't always scream. Sometimes it's in the small silences, the too quick deflections, the way someone avoids your eyes. From that moment, I knew I couldn't just let it go. I started small. I looked at old photos of myself as a child, compared them to Leo. My mother had always said I had a particular cowlick, a way my hair parted stubbornly. Leo didn't have it. His features, sharper nose, darker eyes, seemed foreign. But was that just paranoia twisting perception? Genetics can be unpredictable. Still, doubt not. The following Saturday, we returned to the pool. Leo wanted to practice again. As I guided him into the water, I scanned the deck. Kurt wasn't there, but the echo of his words haunted every ripple. Mira sat tense on the lounge chair, sunglasses covering her face. She barely cheered this time. When we got home, she went straight to bed, claiming a headache. I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, feeling my life tilt on its axis. I realized something then. I couldn't rely on Mira to tell me the truth. If she was hiding something, she'd bury it deep. I couldn't rely on Kurt either. He was playing some twisted game. If I wanted answers, I would have to find them myself. That was the night I decided I would investigate. Quietly, carefully, like a detective. And once I started down that path, there would be no turning back. Once a seed of doubt is planted, it doesn't just sit quietly. It grows, winding through every corner of your mind, choking out certainty, wrapping itself around memories you thought were solid. That week after Kurt's comment at the pool, I felt like I was walking through my own life as an undercover agent, pretending to be the same husband and father, while inside, I was searching for cracks in the foundation. I told myself I would keep things subtle. No outbursts. No accusations. If there was something to uncover, I needed to approach it methodically. I needed to be sure. The first step was the simplest: photographs. I pulled out the albums Mira had made when Leo was born. There he was, swaddled in blue blankets, his tiny fists curled. My chest tightened at the sight. I remembered holding him for the first time, tears stinging my eyes as I promised silently to always protect him. But now, when I looked closer, I couldn't stop comparing. His eyes, dark brown, nearly black, were nothing like mine. My own were hazel. My father's were hazel. Even my grandfather's were lighter. Genetics can jump, sure, but how far? I dug out my own baby photos. There was a roundness to my face, a crooked little smile. Leo's features seemed sharper, almost as if they belonged to someone else entirely. It felt wrong to even think that way, but once suspicion twists your vision, it's impossible to unsee. Next, I turned to records. Mira and I shared a phone plan, so our call history was accessible online. I knew snooping was low, but I couldn't shake the memory of nights when she used to step out onto the balcony, whispering into the phone, claiming it was her sister or a coworker. Back then, I hadn't thought twice. Now, with Kurt's words echoing, I had to know. Scrolling through the archives, my stomach dropped. Years back, around the time Mira had been pregnant, there were dozens of late-night calls to Kurt's number. Some stretched past midnight. Lengthy conversations, sometimes hours. I sat frozen, staring at the screen glow in the dark. Of course, people can talk. Maybe he was helping her through stress. Maybe it was innocent. But combined with her reaction at the pool, it felt damning. I remembered other details too. During those months, Kurt had been strangely present. He'd bring groceries just because. He'd offer to walk her to doctor appointments when I was stuck at work. At the time, I had been grateful, naive enough to think it was neighborly kindness. Now, every memory felt poisoned. I needed more than circumstantial threads. I needed something concrete. The following weekend, I came up with a plan. I took Leo to the pool again, Mira trailing behind. We went through the motions, me encouraging him to paddle, Mira clapping distractedly from her chair. I positioned us near the benches where neighbors usually left their bags. While Mira wasn't paying attention, I slipped a small digital recorder beneath a towel. I figured if Kurt decided to show up again, maybe I'd catch something. For the next hour, nothing unusual happened. Kurt didn't appear. We eventually went home, tired and sunburnt. I retrieved the recorder later and nearly dismissed it, thinking it had been pointless. But when I played it back that night with earbuds, my pulse spiked. Muffled voices. First Myra's, then Kurt's. They weren't clear, fragments only, but enough. You shouldn't have said anything. He doesn't suspect, not yet. I panicked, okay? What was I supposed to do? Static swallowed the rest, but it was enough to send my mind spinning. Not yet. Those two words replayed until I felt sick. The next few days were torture. Mira acted normal, even affectionate, but I couldn't relax. Every laugh sounded rehearsed. Every touch felt staged. When I asked about Kurt casually, she rolled her eyes and said, "You know he's a loudmouth. Don't feed into his nonsense." But her shoulders were tense, her jaw tight. I started watching Kurt more closely too. From our balcony, I could see his place. He always seemed to be out at odd hours, leaning against his car, phone pressed to his ear. Once, I caught him staring up at our window. When our eyes met, he raised his beer like a toast. I shut the curtains. I kept compiling my silent case. I printed the call logs. I saved the audio file from the recorder. I even noted small details, like how Kurt and Mira never seemed to make eye contact in public anymore, almost like they were trying too hard to avoid suspicion. It reminded me of how thieves sometimes act too casual, which only makes them stand out more. One night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, papers spread out before me like a detective piecing together a crime scene. The pattern was undeniable. Frequent late-night calls during the pregnancy, Kurt's sudden closeness, Myra's panicked reaction at the pool, the cryptic conversation I'd captured. I was no longer imagining things. Something had happened, but I needed the final piece, the one thing that couldn't be twisted or denied. That's when the idea of DNA crossed my mind. It felt like stepping into forbidden territory, like I was betraying my own son just by considering it. But the thought wouldn't let me go. I couldn't move forward without knowing. Quietly, carefully, I started researching. I found private labs that offered discrete paternity testing. All I needed was hair or saliva samples. The process was simple. Too simple. The idea of mailing away the truth about my life in a small plastic bag was both terrifying and magnetic. I began collecting. From Leo's room, I took strands of hair from his brush. From myself, I saved a used cup. For Mira, I had no intention of involving her, not yet. This was between me, my son, and the possibility of Kurt. But before I sent anything, something else happened that nearly pushed me over the edge. It was late, past midnight. I woke thirsty and went to the kitchen for water. Passing the balcony, I saw the glow of a cigarette outside. Mira was there, leaning against the railing, phone pressed to her ear. I couldn't hear the words, but I caught the tone, soft, urgent, intimate. She whispered quickly, then paused, listening, then whispered again. When she turned and saw me through the glass, she jolted. She stubbed out the cigarette, shoved the phone into her robe pocket, and plastered on a smile. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, as though nothing had happened. I just nodded, but inside, something snapped. Enough of the games. Enough of the uncertainty. The next morning, I sealed the samples and mailed them to the lab. The days that followed were agony. Every interaction with Mira felt like a performance. I watched her cook breakfast, fold laundry, kiss Leo's forehead, and wondered how many lies lived beneath her skin. I avoided confrontation, telling myself I needed the results first. But keeping that secret was like carrying a ticking bomb in my chest. Then, midweek, Kurt crossed the line again. I was walking Leo back from school when Kurt strolled up, all swagger. He crouched down, ruffled Leo's hair, and said, "That's my guy. Look at him, spitting image." He winked at me like we shared a private joke. Leo laughed, oblivious, but I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. Every fiber of me wanted to grab Kurt by the collar and demand the truth. Instead, I smiled tightly, pulled Leo close, and walked away. That night, I added another note to my growing file. He called Leo my guy. It was evidence, maybe circumstantial, but combined with everything else, it built a picture that was impossible to ignore. I kept imagining how the truth would land. If the test confirmed my worst fear, then everything, our marriage, our family, even my own identity as a father, would fracture. But if I ignored it, I'd live forever in doubt, poisoned by the suspicion. The choice wasn't really a choice. I had to know. The envelope from the lab arrived sooner than expected. Plain, unmarked, innocuous. My hands shook as I slid it open at the kitchen table while Mira showered. Inside, the report. Words jumped out in bold. Paternity not consistent. Probability of biological relationship, 0%. My world stopped. The paper blurred in my vision. My pulse hammered in my ears. For a moment, I thought I might actually pass out. It was true. Leo was not mine. The room seemed to tilt. Memories flooded back. Leo's first steps, his laughter, his little hand clutching mine, and each one twisted, now tinged with the knowledge that genetically, he was Kurt's. But worse than the shock was the rage that followed. Rage at Mira for lying. Rage at Kurt for smirking in my face. Rage at myself for being blind for so long. Yet even in that storm, I made a decision. I would not explode. Not yet. I folded the report, slid it into my file, and tucked it away. Evidence. Solid, undeniable. Now, the confrontation was inevitable. But it had to be on my terms. Mira emerged from the shower, towel around her hair, smiling as though nothing had changed. She kissed my cheek and asked if I wanted tea. I murmured yes, watching her carefully, realizing she had no idea that I now held the truth in my hands. And with that, suspicion ended. What began now was the hunt for justice. The report sat in my desk drawer like a live explosive. Every time I walked past, I felt the weight of it pressing against the wood, daring me to pull it out and look again. I didn't need to. The numbers were seared into my brain, 0%. No probability. No connection. A stranger had more biological claim to my son than I did. But Leo wasn't a stranger. He was mine in every way that mattered. His laugh, the way he crawled into my lap to show me drawings, the bedtime rituals we had built. And yet, knowing the truth gnawed at me. Each time I tucked him in, I saw Kurt's smirk flickering behind his face. Each time Mira smiled at me across the dinner table, I wondered how many lies curved behind that expression. I knew I couldn't keep the knowledge buried forever. If I did, it would rot me from the inside. But rushing in with accusations would be reckless. Mira had lived with this deception for years. She knew how to deflect. If I cornered her without preparation, she'd twist, she'd deny, she'd invent. I needed more than the report. I needed layers of evidence so dense that she couldn't wriggle free. The detective in me, an amateur one, but sharpened by rage and betrayal, began to assemble the case. First, I cataloged everything I already had. The late-night phone records, the muffled conversation on the recorder, the pointed comments from Kurt, the panicked look on Myra's face at the pool, and now, the DNA results. Together, it painted a clear picture. Still, I wanted an airtight narrative, something undeniable. I began monitoring small patterns at home. Mira had always been protective of her phone, but lately, she seemed glued to it. She'd carry it into the bathroom, sleep with it under her pillow. She claimed it was work emails, group chats, the usual excuses. But I started noting the times. Long stretches late at night, sudden silences when I entered the room. Each instance fed into the file I kept hidden. Then, one evening, I returned home earlier than expected. Mira hadn't heard my key in the door. She was standing in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, voice low but sharp. The conversation ended abruptly when she noticed me, her demeanor flipping instantly into forced cheer. She asked about my day, smiled too quickly. I didn't call her out. I just stored the observation like another puzzle piece. The more I watched, the more I realized how much of my marriage had been smoke and mirrors. I began seeing patterns I had ignored for years. The sudden headaches whenever I suggested intimacy. The unexplained errands that kept her away for hours. The defensive tone when Kurt's name surfaced, always followed by a quick subject change. By then, my anger had transformed into something colder. I no longer wanted just a confession. I wanted her to feel cornered by truth she couldn't escape. I expanded my investigation beyond our apartment. I started paying attention to Kurt's movements. His car was often parked near the building late at night, even when he claimed to be working early mornings. Once, I saw him slip into the stairwell at the same time Mira left with a bag of recycling. They didn't leave together, but the choreography was too precise to be coincidence. I considered direct confrontation with him, but decided against it. Kurt thrived on swagger. If I came at him without preparation, he'd just gloat or deny, feeding off my anger. No, the strike had to be calculated. The tipping point arrived 2 weeks later. I was in the laundry room, pulling out a basket, when I overheard two neighbors talking outside. Their voices were casual, joking, but the words froze me. They mentioned how Mira and Kurt seemed unusually close, how they always disappeared from gatherings at the same time, how they'd once seen them leaving the parking lot within minutes of each other. The neighbors laughed it off, saying maybe they were just good friends, but their tone suggested otherwise. I carried the basket back upstairs, heart pounding. Now, even others had noticed. It wasn't paranoia anymore. That night, when Mira fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my growing file spread before me. I stared at the DNA report, the call logs, the notes, the fragments of conversation, and I knew the time had come. I could no longer coexist with the lie, pretending everything was normal while the truth gnawed at me. The confrontation unfolded the next evening. Mira had just finished helping Leo with homework and gone into the bedroom. I followed, file in hand. She was folding clothes, humming under her breath, but stopped when she saw me standing there. The file hit the bed with a thud. She glanced at it, then at me, her face tightening. I didn't shout. I didn't demand. I simply laid out the evidence. The late-night calls, the suspicious conversations, the DNA results. Each piece dropped like a stone in the silence between us. Myra's composure crumbled with every page I revealed. Her hands trembled as she touched the report. She tried denial first, saying the calls were innocent, saying the recorder must have misheard, saying the test must be wrong. But her voice cracked, her arguments thin. Finally, under the weight of the evidence, she broke. Her shoulders sagged, her face pale. She admitted it. There had been a brief affair with Kurt while I was working long shifts. She had been lonely, overwhelmed, vulnerable. Her excuses spilled out in a rush, but none of them mattered. She confessed that it had ended before Leo was born, but clearly, the damage had already been done. Hearing it out loud did not bring relief. It carved something deeper. I stood there, absorbing her words, feeling my life fracture in real time. I had imagined this moment for weeks, but reality was worse than any scenario I'd pictured. Leo, asleep in the other room, remained innocent in all of this. He hadn't chosen his origin. He hadn't lied. My fury was directed at Mira and Kurt, not at the boy who still called me daddy with unshaken trust. But the knowledge poisoned everything. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I let the silence hang, heavy and suffocating. Mira kept talking, begging, reaching for explanations. I turned and walked out, leaving her to stew in her own fear. For the next days, we lived in a tense standoff. She tried to act as though life could return to normal, cooking meals, asking about my work, checking on Leo's school projects. I responded with clipped answers, avoiding her eyes. Every time she smiled, I saw betrayal stitched across her face. Meanwhile, I began the next phase. Consultation with a lawyer. Quiet research into custody laws, property division, and divorce strategies. The lawyer was blunt. Legally, since I was listed as Leo's father on the birth certificate, I had parental rights regardless of biology. That meant I could remain in his life if I chose. But it also meant financial responsibility would follow me. The law did not care about infidelity unless it could be tied to financial damages. The meeting hardened my resolve. This wouldn't just be about heartbreak. It would be about consequences. One evening, Kurt crossed my path in the parking lot. He leaned casually against his car, smirk intact, as if he sensed my storm. He said nothing, just lifted his beer in mock salute. I walked past without a word, but my mind cataloged every detail. Soon enough, he would face exposure too. Mira grew desperate as she sensed my distance. She hovered, asked questions, tried to coax me into conversation. She even suggested counseling, as though betrayal could be smoothed out like a wrinkle in fabric. I remained cold, detached, moving like a shadow through our home. The detective work was over. The evidence was secured. The confession had been extracted. What remained was strategy, choosing the battlefield, timing the strike. Because once the truth came out, it wouldn't just fracture our marriage. It would scorch everything around it. Once the truth is out of its cage, it doesn't return. After Myra's breakdown in the bedroom, after her rushed confession, there was no stuffing it back into silence. I had held my anger, my evidence, and my composure for weeks, but now I felt the weight shifting. I was no longer just a man betrayed. I was a man holding proof, and proof demanded action. The lawyer had been clear. Legally, Leo was mine on paper. That gave me rights, but also responsibilities, whether I liked it or not. It wasn't what I had wanted to hear. Still, it gave me leverage. I could leave Mira and still remain in my son's life, because in every way but biology, he was my son. But the lawyer also gave another piece of advice. He said that sometimes, infidelity cases didn't need to go to court to create consequences. Sometimes, simply revealing the truth to the right people was enough to dismantle the lies. That thought settled deep inside me. The first step was gathering everything into one neat package. I assembled the DNA report, the call logs, the recorded fragments, and my notes into a binder. It looked clinical, almost like a case file a detective would drop on a prosecutor's desk. Then I reached out to Nora, Kurt's wife. She and I had always been polite neighbors, never close. But there was something about her reserved smile, the way she kept to herself, that made me think she deserved to know. If I had been left in the dark, she likely had too. I asked if she could meet for coffee. Her brow furrowed when I suggested it. but she agreed. At the cafe, she sat across from me, eyes wary. I placed the binder on the table, slid it toward her, and told her to read. She opened it hesitantly, scanning the contents. As she flipped page after page, her face shifted from confusion to horror to a kind of trembling fury. When she reached the DNA report, she closed the binder and pressed her hands over her mouth. Her first reaction wasn't disbelief. It was recognition. She admitted that she had suspected something for years. She had noticed Myra's presence in their lives, the odd phone calls, Kurt's sudden disappearances, but she had never had proof. Now, looking at the binder, she had more proof than she had ever wanted. We didn't need to say much more. She walked out of the cafe with the binder tucked under her arm, her posture rigid. I watched her leave, knowing the next move was in her hands. The explosion came 2 days later. It was early evening when raised voices echoed down the hallway. I stepped outside and saw Nora on the landing, binder open, pages scattered like shrapnel. Kurt stood opposite her, face flushed, shouting. Neighbors poked their heads out of doors, drawn by the commotion. Nora's words cut through the air. She accused him, laid out the evidence, declared what he had done. She hurled the DNA report at him, the paper fluttering like a white flag that wasn't surrender. Kurt's bravado faltered under the eyes of half the building. He stammered, tried to laugh it off, but there was no smirk left in him. Nora slammed their apartment door behind her, leaving him outside with the wreckage of his lies. I didn't step in. I didn't need to. My role was finished. The truth was doing its work. At home, Mira sat on the couch, pale and silent. She had heard everything from the window. She didn't ask me what came next. She already knew. That weekend, I told her plainly. She had until the end of the week to move out. The apartment was mine, the lease in my name. I would not fight her for Leo, because I intended to remain in his life, but she would not remain my wife. There was no yelling, no bargaining, just finality. She tried tears, promises, pleas. She begged for therapy, for second chances, for the sake of Leo. But my mind was a locked vault. I had given her years of trust, and she had repaid it with lies so deep they rewrote the very foundation of our family. Nothing she said could undo that. By Friday, her suitcases were stacked by the door. She kissed Leo's forehead, whispered something I didn't catch, and left without looking back at me. Kurt moved out a week later, after Nora filed for divorce. His swagger was gone. The same neighbors who once shared beers with him now turned away, whispering behind his back. He had become the pariah of the complex, exposed by his own arrogance and my quiet investigation. As for Leo, I made a choice. I would not punish him for the sins of the adults. He still ran to me with drawings, still asked me to tuck him in, still saw me as his father. Biology could not erase years of love. I decided I would raise him as mine, even if his blood said otherwise. That decision didn't erase the pain, but it gave me something to hold on to in the wreckage. The gossip in the building eventually died down, but the story never truly disappeared. For months, I would catch whispers by the pool, glances in the parking lot, neighbors shaking their heads. Everyone knew. That was the consequence Mira and Kurt couldn't escape. Their betrayal had been dragged into the daylight, and daylight burned. Looking back, the moment that set everything in motion still replays in my mind. Kurt leaning over the rail, smirking, dropping that single line. It had been arrogance, carelessness, maybe even a deliberate taunt. But it was also the slip that unraveled everything. One sentence had turned my life upside down. But in the end, it also gave me clarity. The truth is brutal. It destroys illusions, but it also sets you free. I was no longer the husband living in ignorance, no longer the neighbor nodding politely at a man who laughed behind my back. I was something else now, scarred, yes, but also unshackled. And as I stood once again at the pool with Leo, guiding him across the water, I realized that while Mira and Kurt had lost everything, I still had the one thing that mattered most, the bond between me and the boy who, no matter what the DNA said, still called me Dad.